Experiences, and the book written by the neurologist Jill Bolt Taylor, in which this is a woman who is an expert on the mind and had a stroke. Her book is called A Stroke of Insight, which left her really having to rebuild her entire brain and her entire ability to speak and to move and live in the world. And she describes and has a memory of when she was having this stroke. The stroke affected her right brain abilities. So, if I'm correct about that, and I always mix this up. I always mix up right brain and left brain. But I believe right brain activity has to do with the very logical things that we do, the very empirical things that we do. Things like, my name is this. I do this for a living. I do. This is my phone number. This is my address. All of those things that are kind of essential for creating a very stable kind of presentation of yourself come from that side of the brain. So left brain is okay, here. Thank you. Thank you for that. I just got a very nice graphic here, which actually I think I will post on my website, that really visually gives you the idea of left brain versus right brain. Left brain is thinking in words, linear thinking. That was the phrase I was trying to come up with. Sometimes I'm too far into my right brain. Mathematics, facts, and logic. And so that is actually left brain stuff. And right brain stuff is feelings and visualization and an imagination and intuition, holistic thinking, rhythm, arts. And this is, of course, the side of the brain where your spiritual experiences, your mystical experiences, your even your meditation comes into play. So I had it wrong once again. Left brain is that logical, linear thinking, facts, sequencing side of the brain, and that is the side of the brain, the left brain, which Ms. Taylor had damaged. And as that became damaged, her right brain took over. And as her right brain took over, she began to have these sensations. She began to have these mystical experiences, which she talks about quite eloquently in her book. Normally, in our society today, the left brain thinking has become so dominant that the right brain is often squelched, because we do put such focus on linear thinking, thinking in words, sequencing, logic, all of those things, that it can become quite dominant. And the right brain, which is visual and intuitive, is quieter. So when an opportunity comes for the right brain to take over, which is what happens in meditation, you're accessing the right brain, which allows a different perspective to come through. And this is helpful to the left brain activities too. It reframes them, it assimilates them, it sort of dissolves them, but also in a way digests them. But what happens for many of us is that we don't get an opportunity to access this right brain very often, except when perhaps we're sleeping and through dreams. And so half of our experience as human beings often gets discarded. One of the ways through which this right brain activity is expressed and accessed is through stories, is through mythology. Now, I've mentioned my blog on my website, and I'll mention again today. It's been it's the 30th anniversary of the premiere of what I found to be a life-changing series of interviews that were broadcast on PBS with Bill Moyers interviewing Joseph Campbell. The series was called The Power of Myth, and it was groundbreaking at the time, even though this was something that Campbell had been talking about for many years. And in fact, at the time that he was doing these interviews, he had retired from being a professor of classical of religious studies, and he had moved on, but he'd written this book, and for the first time a wider audience who might not have found him before found a new way to talk about and think about spirituality and mythology. The Greeks knew that there were two ways of looking at the world, and those two ways exactly parallel the two sides of the brain. Mythos and logos were the terms that they had. Logos is left brain stuff, logical thinking, sequencing, all of those things. And mythos, from which the word mythical comes, had to do with intuition, with imagination, with mystical experiences. So truth discovered through logos tries to be objective and universal. So those who primarily have a logos approach to the world use logical thinking and approach the world scientifically and empirically. They look for explanations using observable facts, controlled experiments, and deductive proofs. Those who use mystical or see the world through mythical thinking approach the world through more intuitive means. So you may gain insight into the nature of the world through poetic means, by watching the sunrise and set, by seeing a caterpillar become a butterfly. And one of the ways that we have of explaining experiences that science doesn't do a very good job of looking into is through storytelling, through our mythology. But our mythological or our understanding of myth has become so tattered because myth has been related with untrue, with made up, with a lie, which is not what mythos is at all. Mythos is a different way of expressing the truth. So, not to go too far here, away from what we're talking about, use of these psychedelics allows people who might not ordinarily have access to that side of the mind, or much access to that side of the mind. It gives them greater access to that side of the mind. And so, in doing that, it alleviates a lot of the things like depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder that the logical side of the mind, the left brain mind, is not very good at doing. Because the left brain is constantly evaluating things and constantly remembering things, but doesn't have a way to reframe things, doesn't have a way to cope with things. And that's the value of the right mind. That's the value of mythos. And so we'll talk about what these drugs can really do to help change the mind. But we want to talk about where we left off, particularly when we were talking about this book of Michael Pollan's, How to Change Your Mind. We were talking about the fact that this author, Michael Pollan, that this author had a rather obtuse way of understanding what spirituality was, and he only seemed to awaken to the possibilities of there being different levels of consciousness through this scientific work that is being done on hallucinogens. So I found it a bit amusing as he talks about this. Where we left off was him saying, and this is a quote from his book, "The whole idea of expanding our repertoire of conscious states is not an entirely new idea." It amuses me so much. Not an entirely new. It's probably one of the oldest ideas that has ever existed, as long as man has been around. But he's coming to understand this, so he nods towards Hinduism and Buddhism, which he says are steeped in it. Well, that's undeniably true. They're built, particularly Buddhism is built on, but Hinduism too, on meditation and meditative states, which bring you into other states of consciousness. But he says there are even intriguing precedents in Western science, which obviously for him has all the answers. But he brings up William James, who is someone we've talked about quite a bit, particularly when we were discussing different religions, particularly the New Thought religions. If you listen to those episodes a while back, we discussed him quite a bit. But we'll return to him because I think he's an important author. He was a psychologist back in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And he was a psychologist. He was known for being a pragmatist, and I don't mean that in the regular sense of the word.